Nearly 2 years ago, I testified and provided evidence to a subcommittee of this committee about the existence of a censorship-industrial complex, a network of government agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security, government contractors, including the Stanford Internet Observatory, and big tech social media platforms that conspire to censor ordinary Americans and elected officials alike for holding disfavored views. Today, the censorship-industrial complex is on the defensive. On January 20th, 2025, just hours after his inauguration, President Donald Trump signed an executive order on restoring freedom of speech and ending federal censorship. 1 week earlier, Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg announced, "We're going to dramatically reduce the amount of censorship on our platform." Zuckerberg announced that he and Meta would follow the lead of Elon Musk at X and create crowdsourced fact-checking known as community notes to replace much of the fact-checking the company had outsourced to others. And thanks in large measure to the work of this committee's subcommittee on the weaponization of government last year, as well as to the investigative reporting by those of us here today, we were able to shine some light on some of the worst actors in the censorship-industrial complex, such as the Stanford Internet Observatory, which I singled out in my testimony 2 years ago. In June of last year, the observatory shut down in response to our collective exposés. Unfortunately, the censorship-industrial complex remains almost entirely intact. In Europe, Australia, Britain, Brazil, and other nations in the West continue to seek new forms of censorship and information control, including digital identification tied to social media. My colleagues and I are over 2 years into our research characterizing the censorship-industrial complex, and we continue to discover whole new institutions involved in censorship. The latest is the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID. Last October, we published a report that noted that USAID had funded the creation of a censorship-industrial complex in Brazil, complete with third-party fact-checkers, committees of experts in charge of deciding for the entire society what the truth is on any given issue. And after I published the Twitter Files Brazil last spring, the Attorney General of Brazil opened a formal criminal investigation of me, which is still ongoing. In 2021, USAID even published a so-called disinformation primer that called for advertiser outreach to disrupt the funding and financial incentive to disinform. Such advertiser outreach was precisely the advertiser boycott strategy used by groups with ties to the U.S. intelligence community. Those groups with uncritical support and amplification from the news media were able to use the strategy to successfully get Facebook and Twitter to censor more content. And the European Commission appears intent upon using its powers granted to it through the Digital Services Act to demand that X, Facebook, and other platforms censor speech. The Commission last year threatened to fine X up to 6% of its annual global revenue for failing to crack down on so-called false information and not handing over its data to small committees of experts chosen by the Commission to decide what is true and false. To be sure, the momentum is with us, the free speech advocates. We've won a number of important battles over the last 2 years. But it's also clear that many governing and media elites worldwide view expanding censorship of online platforms as a must-have, not a nice-to-have feature of global governance. The head of NATO, NATO-backed think tanks, the European Commission, former President Barack Obama, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Bill Gates, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum, influential think tanks at Harvard and Stanford, elements of the DoD, the CIA, the FBI, the National Science Foundation, the Department of Homeland Security, and many others have all called for government censorship of so-called misinformation in recent years. And it's not just censorship that's the problem. The problem is that deep state agencies within the U.S. government have for 2 decades sought to gain control over the production of news and other information around the world as part of ongoing covert and overt influence operations. And that after 2016, multiple actors in several deep state U.S. government agencies turned to the tools of counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, and counterpopulism against the American people. I strongly urge Congress to defund the censorship-industrial complex and seek a proper accounting of the various efforts to fund it, including secretly through pass-through organizations and shell organizations like the ones employed by USAID to fund groups like OCCCRP and hide U.S. government funding and control. I further urge Congress to seek other ways to reduce the exposure of American social media users and companies to the threat of censorship from Europe, Britain, Brazil, and other nations. We should respect national sovereignty, but Vice President Vance makes a good point when he asks why Americans should be spending our wealth and putting our lives on the line for Western European NATO members who are actively demanding censorship by American companies of our speech. Thank you very much.